The papers were still warm from the printer when my son slid them across my kitchen table, their sharp chemical smell lifting into the cold afternoon air. Sunlight cut through the blinds in thin, accusing lines, dust floating between us like evidence of something I hadn't yet understood. And as I stared at those documents, meant to separate him from any responsibility for me, I felt the room tilt in a way that had nothing to do with age. If you've ever had a moment where someone you love reveals who they really are, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. These stories happen in the quiet corners of ordinary lives more than we admit. I didn't know it then, but that single moment would set off a chain of events none of us could escape. Let me show you how it all began. I never imagined the sharpest pain of my life would arrive on a quiet afternoon in Cedar Ridge. One moment, I was tending to the small routines that keep my days steady, and the next, my son was standing in my doorway with a stack of papers that felt heavier than anything paper should ever be. I could see, even before he spoke, that he had already made up his mind. The look in his eyes told me I had slipped from mother to obligation, and that realization cut deeper than the documents themselves. As he pushed those papers toward me, I felt something inside me fold in on itself. Shock washed over me first, cold and hollow. Then came the sting, the disbelief that my own child could see me as a burden he needed to sever from his life. I kept my hands still, but inside, I was replaying decades of love and sacrifice, wondering when they stopped mattering to him. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that I had already been carrying a truth far larger than anything written on those pages. I had been preparing myself quietly, holding on to something he would never expect. And as he stood there, convinced he was taking control, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. That moment didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of years, choices, and a life that shaped both of us. And to understand how we reached that doorway, I need to go back to where it all began. My life in Cedar Ridge had always been quiet, almost predictable in its simplicity. After my husband passed, the world seemed to dim around the edges, and I learned to build my days out of smaller pieces. Morning coffee on the balcony, the short walk to the library, the comfort of familiar shelves and returning patrons. Working part-time as a library aide didn't bring in much, but it offered structure, purpose, and a sense of belonging I clung to more than I admitted. My apartment was modest, tucked above a little bakery that smelled like warm bread every morning. I kept it tidy, not out of pride, but because order made the loneliness easier to carry. The evenings were the hardest, when the town quieted and the walls seemed to press closer. I filled the silence with old photo albums, gentle music, or knitting projects I rarely finished. Nathan and Emily lived only a short drive away, yet the distance between us felt far larger. We kept things polite, careful. I tried to stay connected without hovering, dropping off a homemade casserole now and then, sending a birthday card a week early so it wouldn't get lost in the shuffle, reminding myself not to expect too much. I sensed their lives were busy, full of things that didn't include me, but I held on to tiny glimmers of closeness whenever they appeared. Still, beneath my routines, there was a fragile balance holding everything together. I knew it wouldn't take much to shake it loose, and when the moment finally arrived, it came quietly, just like most things in my life had. It started with the one place I thought I could depend on, my job at the library. I still remember how ordinary the morning felt before everything shifted. I had shelved a few returns, straightened the children's corner, and taken comfort in the soft rhythm of the library. Then, without warning, the ground seemed to crack beneath me. The news came abruptly, delivered in a few clipped sentences that left no room for questions. One moment I belonged there. The next, I was simply no longer needed. I felt the air change around me, as if the walls themselves were quietly closing in. I gathered my things slowly, trying to steady my hands as I placed my mug, my pens, and the little knit bookmark I kept at the desk into my tote. It wasn't much, but it was my small world, and packing it up felt like erasing a part of myself. The financial worry rose first, sharp and undeniable. Losing that modest paycheck meant losing the thin safety net I had stitched together over years. But the deeper ache came from the sudden loss of purpose. The silence left behind when a familiar routine is taken away. Driving home, I kept replaying the moment, searching for signs I had missed. The town rolled past my window in a blur, and with every mile, the uncertainty grew heavier. I tried to breathe through it, telling myself I had weathered storms before, even if this one felt different. I didn't know it yet, but something unexpected was already moving toward me. Something that would arrive in the form of a certified letter waiting in my mailbox. The certified envelope was waiting in my mailbox when I returned home, tucked between grocery flyers and a utility bill. I noticed the international postmark first, a place I had never visited and had no ties to. For a moment, I wondered if it had been delivered to the wrong address. Nothing in my quiet life ever arrived with that kind of formality. Still, my name was printed clearly, and the weight of the packet felt intentional, almost solemn. Inside my kitchen, I sat at the small table where I paid bills and read recipes I rarely tried. I opened the envelope carefully, half expecting it to be a mistake. But as I unfolded the letterhead from the overseas law firm, the words began to pull me into a reality I could hardly grasp. My great-aunt Margaret, a woman I had met only once as a girl, had passed away, and she had left me everything, an estate valued at $89,000. The number didn't feel real. It looked like something from a newspaper article about strangers, not a figure tied to my name. I read it again, slower this time, letting each digit settle. A strange stillness came over me, as if my mind needed to quiet itself before it could absorb the truth. I remembered that single childhood visit to her home, how she had watched me help her carry a tray of teacups without being asked. She had smiled at me with a softness I didn't understand back then. Somehow, that tiny moment had stayed with her for a lifetime. I sat there for a long time, palms pressed against the cool table, feeling my world widen in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. But I knew this revelation wouldn't stay mine alone. My son's reaction would arrive soon, and it would cut even deeper than the news itself. Nathan reached out a few days after I lost my job, but the tone of his voice carried more duty than warmth. He spoke to me as if I were a fragile responsibility, something he needed to stabilize before it slipped out of control. I could hear the quiet impatience beneath his concern, the way he paused after each suggestion as though waiting for me to admit I couldn't manage my own life anymore. He brought up the idea of downsizing, painting it as a practical choice, though I could feel the subtext settling heavily between us. In his mind, losing my job meant I was one misstep away from becoming a financial burden. The disappointment in his voice stung more than the job loss itself. I had always tried to stand on my own, even when it meant stretching every dollar. But in that moment, He saw only risk where I had always seen resilience. When he arrived at my apartment with a folder of legal documents, the humiliation settled deeper. He framed the paperwork as protection, preemptive measures to shield him and Emily from anything I might someday owe. Signing those forms felt like quietly admitting that my life, in his eyes, had become a cautionary tale. I kept my face steady, but inside, something tender folded in on itself. What he didn't realize, what he never even considered, was that I was already holding a truth powerful enough to turn his assumptions upside down. I said nothing. I let him believe I was small and fragile, because arguing would have only widened the distance between us. But as I watched him leave with that folder tucked under his arm, I knew I couldn't navigate this new reality alone. It was time to speak with an attorney, someone who could help me understand what to do next, and how to shape the future that was suddenly opening in front of me. Holding the truth of my inheritance felt like carrying a quiet flame, steady, powerful, and completely my own. I realized almost immediately that sharing it with Nathan would only invite more control, more assumptions, more of the same condescension I had just endured. So I kept it close, letting the shock settle into something calmer, something far more deliberate. The first step was meeting with the attorney I had worked with years ago, a man who had always spoken to me as if my thoughts carried weight. I watched his expression shift as I laid everything out, the letter, the estate, the impossible number that now belonged to me. Even without words, his reaction told me just how life-altering this was. And strangely, seeing his awe helped me find my own footing. I felt a steadiness rising inside me, a sense of agency I hadn't felt in decades. Together, we began shaping the legal structure of my new reality. Trusts to protect my identity, shell companies to shield my involvement, anonymous entities to keep me insulated from prying eyes. It was overwhelming at first, but each decision made the next one clearer. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was building safety, independence, and the room to make choices without fear. When I started researching Nathan's company and Emily's design studio, I felt another shift. Their businesses were more vulnerable than they ever realized. My wealth opened doors that had always been closed to someone like me, and as I clicked through reports and public filings, I understood just how much influence I could exert without ever stepping into the light. By the end of that week, the hurt they caused no longer defined me. Strategy had taken its place, and with my groundwork laid, I was ready to take my first decisive step, acquiring the assets that would reshape everything they thought they controlled. Moving from preparation to action felt strangely natural, as if the pieces of my life had waited years to fall into place. The first acquisition came quietly, through an anonymous entity. I purchased the building that housed Emily's design studio. I had walked past it many times without imagining it could ever be mine. Yet within weeks, the paperwork was finalized. The new management company, another layer between me and the truth, adjusted the rent to reflect the market. I watched from a respectful distance as Emily struggled to absorb the increase, her confidence slipping each time she realized her business wasn't as stable as she believed. But I didn't intervene. I didn't correct or comfort. I simply observed, letting the natural consequences of her own decisions rise to the surface. Then came Nathan's company. Acquiring it required more steps, more intermediaries, more silence, but eventually, I became the majority owner without ever placing my name on a public document. The morning I attended my first board meeting, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. Nathan walked in late, unaware of the shift that had already taken place. When he realized who the new controlling representative answered to, I saw confusion flicker across his face, then disbelief. He searched the room, trying to make sense of a hierarchy that had quietly rearranged itself. And there I sat, no longer the burden he feared, but the woman whose decisions now shaped his professional world. I didn't gloat. I didn't even smile. I simply held my place with the dignity he had once overlooked. That moment marked the beginning of a new reality, not one built on revenge, but on balance. And as I stepped out of that boardroom, I knew the ripple effects were only just beginning, soon reaching both Nathan and Emily in ways they could no longer ignore. I noticed the first cracks forming in their lives long before they realized anything had changed. It started subtly, almost quietly. Emily's studio, once loud with her confidence, grew strained. Clients who had always been steady began pulling back after the rent increase. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she spent long evenings hunched over her desk, running numbers that refused to balance. She tried offering discounts, new packages, anything to keep the momentum alive. But the weight of overhead she hadn't prepared for pressed down harder each week. I watched from a distance, not with joy, but with a complicated mix of sadness and inevitability. She had dismissed me as if I were an anchor holding her life back. Yet now she was discovering how fragile that life really was. The fear in her eyes during a chance encounter downtown stayed with me longer than I expected. Nathan's unraveling came a little slower, but it was no less clear. As the new structure of the company settled in, major accounts shifted, budgets tightened, and expectations grew more rigid. He had always assumed his job was secure, that his position would rise naturally. Instead, he found himself facing new standards, ones he could no longer meet with charm alone. I heard from a former coworker that he had started arriving early, leaving late, trying to make sense of performance metrics he had ignored for years. There were nights when I sat on my balcony, listening to the quiet of Cedar Ridge, and wondered whether this was justice or something more bittersweet. I had not set out to hurt them. I had only set out to understand my own worth and to protect the future they assumed I didn't have. Yet watching them confront the reality of their choices stirred something deeper in me, an ache that came from knowing how different things could have been. Still, the shift had only begun. I could sense the moment approaching when everything would break open, when the truth behind my inheritance and the test they never knew they were taking would reshape all of us in ways they never imagined. When the first wave of chaos around Nathan and Emily began to quiet, I finally allowed myself to open the remaining documents from the law firm. They had been sitting in a thick envelope on my dining table for weeks, heavy with a kind of expectation I wasn't yet ready to face. But that evening, with the sun lowering behind the pines and the house wrapped in silence, I knew it was time. Inside were files, pages of notes, letters, and carefully organized assessments. My great-aunt Margaret had spent years observing the people in her life, not out of suspicion, but out of a desire to understand who held true character when no one was watching. She had built her fortune quietly, and she had protected it fiercely. The inheritance wasn't simply a gift, it was a deliberate decision made after a long, thoughtful test. As I read through the documents, I began piecing the story together. There were mentions of the day I helped her as a child, a memory I thought had evaporated for her the moment our visit ended. But she had written about it in detail. The patience I showed, the way I noticed her struggling without being prompted, the gentleness she said she rarely saw in others. That small moment, so ordinary to me, had planted something deep in her mind. Then came the harder pages. Margaret had watched Nathan over the years, too. She had seen how he spoke about responsibility, how he treated his obligations when things were easy, and how quickly he distanced himself when life became inconvenient. She had even noted how Emily reacted when she believed no one would ever hold her accountable. Reading those words, I felt a slow ache build in my chest. My son and his wife had failed a test they never even knew they were taking. And in a way, so had I, at least at first. I had spent years shrinking myself, apologizing for taking up space, doubting my worth. But Margaret had recognized something in me I had forgotten. Sitting there with those files spread across the table, I realized the truth. The inheritance wasn't just about money. It was about clarity, about seeing people as they truly were, without the comforts that hid their intentions. Holding that knowledge, I felt the weight of choice settle over me. The next steps weren't about punishment. They were about deciding who I wanted to be with the power I had been given. And that understanding carried me gently toward the final decision I knew I had to make. I watched the aftermath unfold from a quiet distance, not out of cruelty, but out of a need to finally see the truth without looking away. Nathan and Emily moved through their days with a kind of stunned heaviness, each burdened by consequences shaped long before they ever felt the ground shift beneath them. Their choices, the dismissiveness, the entitlement, the willingness to cut me loose when they believed I had nothing, had written this ending long before I ever acted. And standing where I am now, I finally understand that the hardest part was accepting how little of it had ever been about me. For years, I let myself believe I was asking for too much simply by existing. I thought love had to be earned by shrinking, by staying quiet, by taking up as little space as possible. But the test Margaret left behind was never about wealth. It was about character. And once the truth surfaced, there was no need for punishment. Life handled that on its own. Still, I won't pretend it all sits easily on my heart. There are days when I wish Nathan had chosen differently, when I wonder what our lives might have looked like if he had seen me as a person instead of an obligation. But clarity has its own kind of peace, and with it, I've begun shaping a future rooted in dignity, independence, and purpose. This fortune will go toward building something steady and meaningful. Scholarships, community programs, quiet acts of help for people who understand compassion in ways my own family never tried to. As for me, I'm learning to live without apology. And maybe that is the real inheritance. If you've ever faced a moment where someone revealed who they truly were when you needed them most, I'd like to hear your story in the comments. In the quiet that followed everything, I finally understood that my worth had never depended on who chose to see it. It lived in the choices I made, the boundaries I honored, and the courage it took to believe I deserved more than silence or dismissal. This journey taught me that people reveal themselves in the moments when nothing is at stake. And sometimes the hardest truth is accepting what they choose to show. Now I'm learning to live with a steadier heart, grateful for clarity and gentleness in equal measure. And if my story offers anything, I hope it reminds you that protecting your peace is never selfish. It is necessary. If this resonated with you, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe for more stories. And I would truly love to hear your experiences. When did someone's true character reveal itself to you?